At my brother's lavish country club wedding, my parents grabbed a microphone, publicly disowned me in front of 800 guests, and ordered security to drag me out. They claimed I was a jealous spinster trying to destroy our family name. I stood there in silence as the guards closed in, completely unfazed. Because they had no idea that in exactly 3 minutes, a high-powered estate lawyer was going to walk through those ballroom doors, hand me the keys to their entire empire, and leave them with absolutely nothing. My name is Abigail. I am 35 years old, and for my entire life, I was the designated bank account for my family's toxic mistakes. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my parents' perfect image at the most expensive wedding of the year, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stop setting yourself on fire just to keep your ungrateful family warm. Trust me, you will want to hear how this spectacular revenge unfolded. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago meant projecting perfection at all costs. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and imported Italian marble floors, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight grades, earned a full academic scholarship to a top university, and eventually built a highly successful career as a forensic accountant. But none of it mattered. In my parents' eyes, I was merely the warm-up act for my younger brother Carter. Carter was the golden child. He was 32 years old, arrogant, entitled, and possessed a remarkable talent for failing upward. While I spent my 20s working 80-hour weeks to build my financial consulting firm, Carter bounced from one disastrous startup idea to another, leaving a trail of maxed-out credit cards and empty promises in his wake. My parents, Diane and Richard, always bailed him out. They remortgaged properties, drained savings accounts, and constantly demanded that I contribute my hard-earned money to support his visionary ventures. When I finally started saying no, I became the family villain. It all came to a boiling point last Saturday, halfway through the reception at the Oak Ridge Country Club. The champagne was flowing, the 12-tier cake was waiting to be cut, and Carter was glowing next to his beautiful new bride, Naomi. Naomi is an incredibly smart, hard-working anesthesiologist, an African-American woman who had clawed her way through medical school entirely on her own merit. Watching her marry into my family felt like watching a brilliant scholar walk into a trap. I was sitting at a table in the far back, placed conveniently near the kitchen swinging doors, so I would not ruin my mother's carefully curated aesthetic. The live jazz band was in the middle of a smooth rendition of a classic love song when the music abruptly screeched to a halt. The sudden silence in the massive ballroom was deafening. I looked up from my plate of roasted sea bass to see my mother Diane marching across the polished mahogany dance floor. Her designer silk gown rustled loudly in the quiet room. She marched straight up to the stage, snatched the microphone directly from the lead singer's hand, and turned to face the crowd. 800 pairs of eyes shifted toward her, expecting a heartfelt mother of the groom's speech. Instead, her piercing gaze found me in the back corner. "Abigail," she barked into the microphone, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "I want you to pack up your things and leave this venue immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of guests. Naomi looked terrified, whispering frantically to Carter, who simply stood there with a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face. My father Richard stood next to my mother, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of authority, nodding in total agreement. I did not move. I placed my fork down on the thick linen tablecloth, picked up my napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and met my mother's furious stare. Diane gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles turning bone white under the stage lights. "Did you hear me, Abigail? You are ruining your brother's special day. We all know you refuse to contribute a single dime to the vendor funds. You are sitting here drinking our vintage champagne and eating our expensive food while actively trying to sabotage the most important moment of Carter's life out of sheer bitter jealousy. Security is on their way right now, and you will be escorted off the premises." You are no longer part of this family. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Aunts, uncles, and family friends who had known me since I was a little girl in pigtails were whispering behind their hands, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. They bought the narrative because they always bought the narrative. For 35 years, Diane and Richard had painted Carter as the brilliant entrepreneur who was always just one deal away from making his millions, while I was the cold, selfish spinster accountant who refused to support her own flesh and blood. But I was not the scared teenager they used to guilt trip into handing over her babysitting money anymore. I stood up slowly, smoothing the skirt of my emerald green dress. I did not cry. I did not scream defensively. I did not beg for them to lower their voices. Instead, I projected my voice across the silent ballroom, clear, sharp, and entirely unwavering. Refuse to contribute, Diane, I asked, taking a few measured steps forward so the entire room could hear the absolute certainty in my tone. That is a fascinating rewriting of history. I suppose the $10,000 wire transfer I sent directly to the florist yesterday morning for those imported white orchids covering the entrance archway was just a figment of my imagination. Diane flinched, pulling the microphone away from her mouth for a fraction of a second before recovering her composure. "How dare you lie in front of our guests?" She snapped, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "We paid for those flowers. We paid for everything today. You have done nothing but drag Carter down since the day he was born." I laughed. It was a sharp, cold sound that made several guests in the front row shift uncomfortably in their gilded Chiavari chairs. "Drag him down," I countered, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a scalpel. Just like I dragged him down 5 years ago when I drained $50,000 from my own personal savings account to pay off his DUI settlement. You remember that, right, Richard? The settlement I paid so your golden boy would not spend a year in a state penitentiary and permanently lose his driver's license. Was I ruining his precious life then, or was my bank account just extremely convenient for you? The ballroom erupted into completely uncontained, shocked gasps. Naomi's head snapped toward Carter, her eyes wide with absolute betrayal. Carter's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. He grabbed Naomi's arm, leaning in to try and whisper frantic explanations into her ear, but she yanked her arm away violently. She stared at him as if he were a complete stranger. He had never told her about the drunk driving charge. He had never told her about the massive settlement. He had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies, pretending to be a self-made success, while I secretly paid for his mistakes. "Shut your mouth right now, Abigail!" Richard bellowed, his face turning purple with rage. He abandoned his post next to my mother and stormed aggressively toward my table, his fists clenched at his sides. "You have absolutely no right to bring up private family business here. You are a liar and a toxic stain on this family's legacy. We gave you everything, we put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay us. By trying to humiliate your brother in front of his new wife and our friends. Guards, where are the venue guards? Get this woman out of my sight right now before I throw her out myself." Two burly security guards in matching dark suits pushed through the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room. They looked nervous, clearly uncomfortable with being dragged into a vicious, highly public family dispute, but Richard waved them over frantically, his face contorted in anger. "Remove her," he ordered, pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at my face. "She is trespassing on private property." The guards approached me cautiously, their heavy footsteps echoing against the hardwood floor. "Ma'am," one of them said, gently reaching out to firmly grasp my upper arm. "We are going to have to ask you to come with us quietly. Please do not make a scene. We do not want to call the local police." I looked down at the guard's large hand gripping my arm, then looked back up at the stage to face my family one last time. Diane was breathing heavily, clutching the microphone against her chest like a shield. Richard was glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. And Carter, having realized he could deal with Naomi's anger later, as long as he got rid of me now, had returned to his arrogant, entitled baseline. He picked up his crystal champagne flute from the sweetheart table, raised it high in the air for all the guests to see, and offered me a slow, mocking toast. Goodbye, Abby, he mouthed silently from across the room, a nasty smile playing on his lips. I did not resist the security guards. I let them hold my arms, my face completely expressionless, staring right back at my brother. Let them think they won this battle. Let them savor this tiny, pathetic victory. Because as the guards turned me toward the exit, I glanced at my watch. It was exactly 2 o'clock. They thought they were erasing me from the family, but they had no idea that their entire world was about to come crashing down. The two security guards took exactly one step toward the exit, their hands gripping my arms when a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the massive ballroom. The heavy 12-foot oak doors at the main entrance did not just open. They were shoved apart with such immense force that one of the solid brass handles struck the plaster wall, leaving a visible dent. The live jazz band, which had been nervously shuffling their sheet music, trying to decide whether to play or pack up, froze completely. 800 heads snapped toward the back of the room. Walking through those doors was Thomas Gallagher. He was a man who commanded absolute authority, a senior partner at the most ruthless estate and trust litigation firm in the entire state. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, carrying himself with the posture of a military general stepping onto a battlefield. His expression was absolute granite. Flanking him were two younger associates, both wearing identical dark suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. They moved in perfect synchronization, their hard leather shoes clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. They completely ignored the elaborate ice sculptures, the imported white orchids, and the hundreds of staring guests. Richard, assuming this high-powered legal team was somehow related to his own inflated importance in the business community, puffed out his chest. He quickly abandoned his post on the stage next to my furious mother. He jogged down the center aisle, forcing a hearty, artificial laugh that echoed awkwardly in the quiet room. Gallagher Richard boomed, extending his hand. I did not invite you, but you are welcome to grab a drink at the open bar. We are just dealing with a minor security issue right now. My daughter was just leaving. Mr. Gallagher did not slow down. He did not extend his hand. He did not even look at my father. He walked straight past Richard as if the man were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture blocking his path. The absolute, undeniable dismissal made Richard stumble over his own feet, his hand left hanging in the air. His face flushed with fresh humiliation as guests in the front row began to whisper frantically to one another. Gallagher marched directly to my table in the back corner of the room. He stopped dead in front of the two burly security guards, who were still firmly holding my arms. Remove your hands from my client, Gallagher said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that made the air in the room feel instantly colder. The guards, recognizing the kind of man who could end their careers and bankrupt their security company with a single phone call, instantly let go. They stepped back, hands raised in surrender, mumbling quiet apologies, and quickly retreating toward the kitchen doors. I smoothed down the sleeves of my dress and met his intense gaze. You are exactly on time, Thomas, I said evenly, my voice betraying absolutely no emotion. I always am, Ms. Foster, he replied with a crisp nod. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, turned slightly so his voice would project across the silent, staring crowd, and delivered the first crushing blow. Abigail, it is with deep regret that I must inform you officially. Your grandfather, Harrison Foster, passed away at 1:15 this morning. A collective gasp went up from the older family members scattered throughout the room. Diane let out a sharp theatrical cry from the stage, instantly trying to play the role of the grieving, heartbroken daughter-in-law. She covered her face with her hands, waiting for the sympathetic murmurs of her wealthy friends. But Gallagher held up a single commanding hand, silencing her fake tears immediately. As you are aware, Abigail Gallagher continued, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity, I am here to execute his final wishes. Per the binding legal documents finalized and filed with the state Supreme Court 24 hours ago, you have been named the sole executor of the Harrison Foster estate. Furthermore, You are now the singular uncontested heir to the entire foster family trust, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody in the massive ballroom dared to breathe. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Then the sharp, violent sound of breaking crystal shattered the quiet. Carter had dropped his champagne flute. It smashed against the hardwood floor near the head table, sending expensive alcohol and glass shards flying over Naomi's custom designer wedding shoes. Carter's arrogant, mocking smirk was completely gone. It was replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, uncomprehending horror. He stared at me, then at the lawyer, then back at me, shaking his head rapidly as if trying to dislodge water from his ears. Naomi, sitting right next to him, did not reach out to comfort him. She is a brilliant woman who analyzes critical medical data for a living. She looked at Carter's trembling hands, looked at the terrifyingly calm lawyer, and her eyes narrowed. You could practically see the gears turning in her head, realizing that the self-made millionaire she had just married was currently experiencing a total psychological collapse over someone else's money. Diane rushed forward from the stage, her high heels clicking frantically as she pushed past a table of stunned guests. "What did you just say?" she shrieked, all traces of her refined country club persona completely evaporating into raw panic. "That is impossible. That is a lie." Harrison hated her. He cut her out of the family functions years ago because she is a selfish brat. "He did not cut her out," Diane Gallagher replied coldly, turning his gaze toward my mother. He looked at her with blatant disgust. "He distanced himself because he could not stomach watching you and your husband treat his brilliant granddaughter like a financial pack mule. And he certainly did not want you spending his hard-earned money on this absolute circus of a wedding." Richard finally recovered from the shock of being ignored. He marched down the center aisle, his face a terrifying mask of rage and desperation. He physically shoved one of Gallagher's young associates aside to get face-to-face with the senior attorney. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at Gallagher's chest. "Listen to me very carefully," Gallagher Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You are making a massive fool of yourself. You are trying to ruin my son's wedding with a sick joke. My father was a traditionalist. That trust contains over $40 million in commercial real estate, international stock portfolios, and liquid assets. It is an ironclad generational wealth fund, and the bylaws of that trust state clearly that upon his death, control defaults entirely to the firstborn male heir. That is my son Carter, not this bitter, ungrateful girl who just wants to ruin our family." Carter, suddenly finding his courage now that his father was fighting his battle for him, stepped out from behind the sweetheart table. He pointed at me from across the room. "That is right," Carter yelled, his voice cracking slightly with panic. "Grandpa promised me that money. That trust is mine. I need it. You cannot just walk in here and hand my inheritance to a jealous accountant. I will sue you. I will sue your entire firm into the ground." Mr. Gallagher did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Richard with an expression of profound pity, the exact kind of look a person gives a cockroach right before stepping on it. He reached out his hand without looking back. His associate immediately snapped open a leather briefcase and handed Gallagher a thick stack of legal paperwork bound with a heavy blue state seal. Gallagher calmly held the document out. Richard refused to take it, crossing his arms stubbornly. Gallagher simply pressed the thick stack of papers firmly against Richard's chest, forcing my father to grab it or let it fall to the floor. Richard grabbed it, his eyes darting frantically over the bold legal print on the first page. "You are absolutely correct, Richard," Mr. Gallagher said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that carried to every single corner of the dead-silent ballroom. "The original trust did default to the firstborn son, until your father discovered exactly what you and Carter have been doing behind his back for the last 3 years. He changed the entire trust yesterday morning. You get nothing." Richard stared at the heavy blue seal on the legal document as if it were a venomous snake. The words "you get nothing" hung in the stale air of the ballroom, echoing in the absolute silence. For a moment, the entire wedding reception was frozen in time. Then the spell broke, and the golden child finally snapped. Carter let out a sound that was half gasp, half roar. He slammed his hands down on the sweetheart table with such violent force that the expensive crystal glassware tipped over, spilling expensive champagne across the imported lace tablecloth. He completely ignored his new bride. Naomi jolted back in her chair, her eyes wide with shock, as the man she had just married abandoned her at the head table. Carter sprinted down the center aisle, his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket flapping wildly behind him. He lunged directly at Mr. Gallagher, his hands clawing aggressively for the thick stack of trust documents. "Give me that!" Carter screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "It is fake! You are lying! You forged this!" The two younger legal associates moved with the cold, calculated precision of trained bodyguards. One stepped swiftly in front of Carter, firmly planting a flat hand against his chest to halt his momentum, while the other casually shifted his heavy leather briefcase to block Carter's reach. Carter bounced off the associate like a toddler throwing a tantrum, stumbling backward in his polished dress shoes. Mr. Gallagher did not even blink. He simply adjusted his cuffs, entirely unbothered by my brother's pathetic display of aggression. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Thomas," I said calmly, never taking my eyes off my brother. "May I have the executor's copy, please?" Gallagher reached into the inner pocket of his pinstripe jacket and handed me a pristine folded document. I took it from him and opened it slowly. I deliberately let the crisp sound of the heavy parchment echo through the tense, silent room. For years, I had been the family scapegoat, the quiet forensic accountant who existed only to balance their books and fund their mistakes. But numbers were my language, and today those numbers were going to set the record straight. "Let us clear up this confusion right now," I announced, my voice projecting effortlessly across the sea of staring guests. As a forensic accountant, I spend my entire professional life tracking hidden assets, unraveling corporate fraud, and following the money trail. It seems my grandfather finally asked an independent auditor to look into his own books, and what they found was nothing short of criminal. Richard opened his mouth to shout me down, but the sheer panic on his face betrayed him. Diane grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit sleeve, looking like she was about to faint. "Clause 4, Paragraph 2 of the amended trust," I read aloud, scanning the dense legal text with practiced ease. "I, Harrison Foster, hereby permanently revoke all inheritance rights, privileges, and financial distributions previously granted to my son Richard and my grandson Carter. This decision is executed immediately upon my death, following the discovery of massive, unforgivable financial breaches committed against my estate." I lowered the document slightly and looked directly at my father. It turns out, Richard, that Grandpa Harrison finally noticed the fraudulent activity on his commercial real estate portfolio. You thought he was too old and too sick to review his own property deeds. But he discovered the $2.5 million equity line of credit that you and Diane secretly took out against his commercial plaza in downtown Chicago. The plaza he owned free and clear for 40 years. You forged his signature on the collateral documents. Murmurs of shock rippled through the ballroom. Aunts and uncles, who had always treated my parents like suburban royalty, were suddenly whispering furiously to one another. "And where exactly did that $2.5 million go?" I asked, turning my gaze to Carter. Carter was breathing heavily, his face slick with sweat, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his features. According to the audit attached to this trust, that money was funneled directly into Carter's tech startup through a series of untraceable shell companies. The exact same tech startup that promised to revolutionize the market but quietly filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy, 6 months ago. You bled an 80-year-old man dry to fund luxury cars, designer watches, and a fake millionaire lifestyle you did not earn. Diane let out a dramatic sob, clutching her chest. "Abigail, stop it!" she wailed, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left in front of her country club friends. "You are humiliating us in front of everyone. How can you be so cruel to your own blood?" "Cruel," I countered, my tone dropping to ice. "Cruelty is watching your daughter work 80-hour weeks to build her career, only to demand she empty her savings to pay for the floral arrangements at a wedding funded by stolen money. Cruelty is telling 800 people that I am a jealous spinster because I refuse to keep financing a fraud. I looked past my parents and made direct eye contact with Naomi. She was still sitting at the sweetheart table completely alone. Her hands were covering her mouth. As a brilliant anesthesiologist, Naomi was trained to spot warning signs and failing vital statistics. Right now, she was watching the illusion of her perfect wealthy husband flatline right in front of her. She looked at Carter's trembling back, putting the pieces together. The lavish lifestyle, the refusal to let her look at the wedding budgets, the constant defensive attitude whenever money was brought up. It was all a massive, glittering lie. Carter realized the facade was entirely gone. The money was gone. The respect of his peers was gone. He looked around the room, seeing the judgment and disgust on the faces of the guests who had been cheering for him just 10 minutes ago. With his back against the wall, his fear instantly violently morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. He shoved roughly past the legal associate storming up to me until he was standing just inches from my face. His chest heaved, his face turning a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. "You set this up!" he screamed, a thick vein bulging visibly in his neck. "You went to him, did not you? You manipulated a dying old man because you are a pathetic, lonely, miserable accountant who cannot stand to see anyone else be happy. You planned this whole spectacle to ruin my wedding." I did not flinch. I simply looked at him, clutching the executor documents. "You ruined your own life, Carter. I just read the receipt." Carter raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger directly between my eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, you little witch," he snarled, his voice echoing violently through the microphone that Diane had dropped on the stage. "You are going to sign that entire estate over to me right now. You are going to call Mr. Gallagher off, you are going to transfer the deeds, and you are going to fix this. If you do not sign those papers by the end of the day, I swear to God, I will absolutely destroy you. I will call your accounting firm. I will call the state licensing board and tell them you committed elder abuse. I will drag your name through the mud until you lose your business, your license, and every client you have. I will make sure you never work in this state again." The threat hung heavily in the air, vicious and desperate. The entire ballroom waited with bated breath to see if the family scapegoat would finally break under the pressure, just like she always had. I looked at Carter's finger pointing aggressively between my eyes. His threat of destroying my license and my business was the desperate thrashing of a drowning man. I smiled, a tight, humorless expression that made him take a half-step back. "You cannot destroy a career built on facts with a foundation of lies, Carter," I said quietly. "Make the call. The state licensing board loves a good paper trail, and I have 3 years' worth of your bank statements ready to hand over." Before Carter could scream another threat, Diane abruptly changed her entire strategy. She is a woman who survives on social currency, and she realized her son's violent outburst was rapidly stripping away their carefully constructed victim narrative. She pushed past Richard and stepped directly into the center of the polished dance floor, throwing her arms wide open to the crowd of 800 guests. She forced a dramatic, tearless sob that echoed loudly through the ballroom. "Listen to me, all of you," she cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated theatrical distress. "Do not believe a single word this horrible woman is saying. This is all a sick, twisted lie." She pointed a shaking hand at me, then gestured wildly toward Mr. Gallagher and his 2 associates. "These men are not lawyers. I have never seen them before in my life. She hired them. She hired cheap actors to come in here, wear nice suits, and wave fake papers around to ruin the most beautiful day of my son's life." The ballroom erupted into loud, confused whispers. Diane pressed her hands to her chest, playing the heartbroken, besieged mother to absolute perfection. "Abigail has always been like this." She projected her voice so even the people in the back rows could hear her. "Always deeply jealous of Carter. She could never find a husband of her own. She isolated herself in her accounting work, and now her bitterness has driven her completely insane." She printed those fake documents at a local copy shop just to humiliate us, because we finally stopped letting her control this family. It was a stunning display of manipulation, and the truly terrifying part was that some of the guests were actually buying it. You could see the shift in their body language. It was simply easier for these wealthy suburbanites to believe in a deranged, jealous spinster sister than to accept that their country club friends were actually broke, fraudulent criminals who stole from an elderly man. Richard caught on to Diane's pivot immediately. He straightened his silk tie, puffed out his chest again, and moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with his wife. "She is absolutely right," he boomed, addressing the crowd with his best authoritative executive voice. "This is grand theft and criminal fraud. She is trying to steal my son's inheritance with forged legal documents. This is a pathetic stunt, and it ends right now." Diane whipped her head around her eyes, scanning the edge of the ballroom until she spotted the general manager of the country club. The manager was a tall, nervous man in a gray suit who had been watching the chaos unfold from near the kitchen swinging doors with an expression of pure terror. "Mr. Higgins," Diane commanded, her voice suddenly dropping the tearful, heartbroken act and snapping like a leather whip. "I want you to lock the main doors of this ballroom right now. Do not let these imposters leave. I want you to call the police immediately. Tell them we have a deranged woman and 3 unidentified men committing corporate fraud, grand theft, and trespassing at our private event. Mr. Higgins hesitated, looking back and forth between Diane, the imposing, unbothered figure of Mr. Gallagher, and me. He pulled his two-way radio from his belt, his hands visibly shaking. "Mrs. Foster, are you entirely sure you want to involve the authorities? This is a family dispute, and a police presence will cause quite a scene that might make the local papers." "I do not care about the scene, or the papers," Diane shrieked, her perfectly styled hair finally falling out of place, strands sticking to her sweaty forehead. "Call them right now. I want her arrested and thrown in a jail cell where she belongs. I want her escorted out of here in handcuffs." Higgins looked over at me silently, pleading for anyone to de-escalate the situation before his prestigious venue turned into a crime scene. I could feel the eyes of 800 people burning into my skin, waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to break down, apologize, and run away, just like I always did when Diane threw one of her massive public tantrums. Instead, I simply shifted my weight casually, crossed my arms over my chest, and gave the manager a polite, encouraging nod. "You heard the woman, Mr. Higgins?" I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of fear or hesitation. "Please make the call. Tell the dispatcher to send at least 2 squad cars. We would not want anyone to miss the grand finale." My absolute lack of panic caused a sudden flicker of doubt to cross Diane's face. Her eyes narrowed, searching my expression for any sign of bluffing, but she was too far gone to back down now in front of her friends. Mr. Higgins lifted the radio to his mouth, instructed his security staff to secure the perimeter doors, and pulled out his cell phone to dial emergency services. The next 10 minutes were agonizingly tense. The jazz band quietly packed up their brass instruments and slipped out the side door, wanting no part of the impending legal nightmare. The catering staff stood frozen against the walls, holding heavy silver trays of melting hors d'oeuvres. A few guests tried to leave the room, but the security staff, following Diane's frantic orders, politely asked them to remain until the authorities arrived to sort out the fraud accusations. The massive 12-tier wedding cake sat completely ignored in the corner, the icing beginning to sag under the warm lights of the chandeliers. Carter paced back and forth near the sweetheart table like a caged animal. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed silk napkin. He aggressively refused to look at Naomi. Naomi sat perfectly still in her white gown. Her sharp eyes darted between me, the legal documents resting calmly in my hand, and her sweating husband. She was a woman of science, a medical professional who dealt with objective reality and high-pressure situations every single day. She knew exactly what a severe panic attack looked like, and she knew Carter was currently having a massive one. Innocent men did not sweat like that. Innocent men whose fortunes were secure did not pace the floor looking for an exit strategy. Mr. Gallagher leaned slightly toward me, adjusting his posture, but never losing his commanding presence. "Your mother is quite the performer, Abigail," he murmured quietly, his eyes calmly scanning the murmuring crowd. "Should we show them the audited bank statements now, to put an end to this circus?" "No," I replied softly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on my parents. Let her dig the hole all the way to the absolute bottom. She wanted an audience. Let her have it. When the truth comes out, I want everyone in this room to remember exactly how hard she lied. Suddenly, the faint, high-pitched wail of sirens pierced the quiet, suffocating tension of the locked ballroom. The sound grew steadily louder, echoing over the sprawling green golf course outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Red and blue lights began to flash rapidly against the glass, casting eerie, rotating shadows across the crystal chandeliers and illuminating the terrified faces of the wedding guests. The police had arrived. Hearing the sirens, Diane let out a heavy breath of pure, vindictive triumph. She believed she had won. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk gown, lifted her chin with arrogant pride, and walked slowly across the dance floor until she was standing right in front of me. She leaned in close, her heavy designer perfume failing to mask the sour smell of her own nervous sweat. She lowered her voice so only I could hear her venomous words. "You overplayed your hand this time, Abigail," she whispered, a wicked, cruel smirk twisting her features into something ugly. "You pushed me too far, and now you are going to prison, you ungrateful wretch." Diane had barely finished hissing her threat when the heavy wooden doors at the front of the ballroom swung wide open. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside their radios, crackling softly, breaking the suffocating silence of the room. They scanned the sea of terrified guests, their hands resting casually on their dark utility belts, assessing the chaotic scene before them. Diane immediately spun away from me, her face transformed in a fraction of a second from a mask of cruel, vindictive triumph to one of helpless, victimized relief. She practically ran toward the officers, the silk train of her expensive gown dragging heavily across the polished hardwood floor. "Officers, thank goodness you arrived so quickly!" she cried out, her voice echoing dramatically across the ballroom. She whipped around and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. "Arrest that woman immediately. She is trespassing at a private event. She has hired fake attorneys, forged state trust documents, and is trying to steal millions of dollars from my son. I want her in handcuffs right now. Take her away." The guests parted like the Red Sea as the two officers walked down the center aisle. But instead of marching toward me with their handcuffs ready, the officers simply glanced at Diane with mild irritation. They did not slow down. They walked right past my mother, completely ignoring her frantic theatrical demands. Diane stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, her arms still pointing at me, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock as the police bypassed her entirely. Mr. Gallagher stepped forward to meet the officers halfway. He did not look like the man who was about to be arrested for fraud. He looked like a man who owned the entire building. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and calmly pulled out his State Bar Association credentials, handing them to the lead officer. "Good afternoon, officers," Mr. Gallagher said, his voice smooth, authoritative, and perfectly steady. "I am Thomas Gallagher, senior partner at Gallagher & Associates. This is my client, Abigail Foster, the legally appointed executor of the Harrison Foster estate. The manager of this establishment was ordered to call you under false pretenses regarding fraud. There is no fraud occurring on our end. All of our documents are verified, court-appointed, and legally binding." The lead officer inspected Gallagher's credentials, gave a respectful nod, and handed the ID card back. "I appreciate the clarification, counselor," the officer replied, his tone strictly professional. "But we did not dispatch 2 units to this location because of a fraud call from the venue manager." Diane, realizing the narrative was violently slipping out of her control, rushed up behind the officers. "What do you mean you did not come because of my call?" she demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "I demanded you come here to arrest her. She is ruining the wedding." The second officer finally turned to look at my mother, his expression entirely unamused. Ma'am, please step back and lower your voice, he ordered firmly, placing a hand gently but definitively in the air to stop her advance. We are responding to a high-priority felony alert that was triggered by the Financial Crimes Division 45 minutes ago. Richard, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, quickly abandoned his spot on the stage and marched over to join his wife. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his wealthy suburban executive persona to take control of the conversation. "Now listen here, officers," Richard boomed, using his deepest, most commanding voice. "I am Richard Foster. This is my son's wedding reception. There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding. My daughter is having a psychological episode and is trying to disrupt a private family function. If you could just escort her and these gentlemen off the premises, we will handle the rest internally." The lead officer did not even blink at my father's attempt to intimidate him. He pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket, flipped it open, and looked directly at my father. "Richard Foster," the officer confirmed, reading the name off the page. "And the groom over there at the head table, that would be Carter Foster." "That is correct," Richard said, crossing his arms, looking slightly relieved that the police finally recognized who was supposed to be in charge. The officer did not smile. He turned to Mr. Gallagher. "Counselor, do you have the primary executor file?" "Right here," Officer Gallagher replied. He snapped his fingers and his associate instantly handed over a thick manila folder containing the financial audit and the amended trust documents. Gallagher passed the folder directly to the police. The audit highlights the unauthorized equity lines of credit, the shell companies, and the specific account numbers in question. The lead officer opened the file, his eyes scanning the highlighted bank statements and the forensic accounting summaries I had meticulously prepared over the last 3 years. The entire ballroom was dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the water glasses on the tables. 800 guests held their breath, watching the wealthy, untouchable Foster family finally face the reality of their own actions. Carter began to slowly back away from the head table. His face was the color of chalk. He looked desperately toward the kitchen swinging doors, clearly calculating if he could make a run for it before the officers noticed him. But Naomi, his brilliant, observant new bride, stood up and took a firm step to the side, intentionally blocking his only clear path to the exit. She crossed her arms, staring at him with eyes that burned with absolute fury. Richard let out an arrogant, dismissive scoff. "I do not know what fake documents that lawyer just handed you, officer, but I assure you my finances are pristine. I am a respected businessman in this community. I demand to know why you are interrupting my son's reception if you are not going to arrest this woman." The lead officer slowly closed the manila folder. He handed it to his partner, then hooked his thumbs into his heavy utility belt. He looked Richard dead in the eye, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Sir, we are not here for the fraud accusations your wife called in," the officer said, his tone dropping to a serious, uncompromising register. "We are here because the Platinum American Express card used to pay the $150,000 catering and venue bill for this reception flagged a major alert in our system." Richard swallowed hard, his arrogant posture instantly collapsing. His arms dropped to his sides. "That is a family account," he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous thunder. "It is a shared trust account. There is no issue. I authorized that payment myself." "No, sir, you did not," the officer corrected him sharply. "You cannot authorize a payment on an account you do not own. That specific credit card was completely frozen by the bank this morning. It flagged our Financial Crimes Division because the primary account holder, Harrison Foster, personally reported that card stolen 3 days ago." A shockwave of gasps ripped through the crowd. The whispers turned into loud, frantic conversations as the wealthy guests finally understood the magnitude of the situation. The golden child's perfect, extravagant wedding had not been paid for by his own successful business. It had not even been paid for by his wealthy parents. It was funded by a stolen credit card belonging to an 80-year-old man who had caught them stealing and cut them out of his will hours before he died. Diane let out a weak, strangled noise, the color completely drained from her face. She looked at the officers, then at Richard, her mind desperately trying to comprehend that she had just ordered the venue manager to lock the doors and call the police on her own husband and son. She had trapped them in a room with the authorities. The officer stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my father. Grand larceny and credit card fraud exceeding $100,000 is a major felony, Mr. Foster. The officer stated, his hand resting casually near his handcuffs. We are going to need you and your son to step away from the guests. We have a lot of questions to ask, and I highly suggest you do not try to lie to us. The ballroom instantly descended into absolute, uncontainable pandemonium. The police officer's words about the stolen credit card acted like a bomb going off in the middle of the dance floor. Wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and country club regulars who had been eager to drink my family's expensive champagne just moments ago suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of an active felony investigation. Guests began grabbing their designer coats and slipping out the side doors as quickly as possible, terrified of being associated with a grand larceny scandal. The extravagant wedding reception was officially over. Richard was sweating profusely. The arrogant, untouchable executive persona he had worn like armor for my entire life was completely shattering under the cold, uncompromising stare of the police officers. He desperately begged the lead officer for just 5 minutes of privacy in the club's VIP lobby to clear up what he frantically kept calling a massive, embarrassing family misunderstanding. The officer reluctantly agreed, warning my father not to try anything stupid, and stationed himself right outside the frosted glass doors of the private lobby. Once those heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, isolating us from the chaos of the ballroom and the watchful eyes of the police, the fake polite masks entirely dropped. It was just me, my parents, Carter, Mr. Gallagher, and Naomi inside the opulent, dimly lit room. Naomi immediately walked over to the far corner, slipping quietly into the shadows near a massive potted fern. She stood completely still, her arms wrapped defensively around her waist, watching my family with the sharp, analytical eyes of a medical professional assessing a critical trauma. Richard wasted absolutely no time. He spun around and marched toward me, his face a terrifying mask of desperation and rage. He pointed a shaking finger inches from my nose. "You listen to me right now, Abigail," he snarled, his voice trembling with panicked urgency. "You are going to tell your lawyer to draft a check from the trust account to this country club this exact second. You are going to pay the $150,000 to clear that balance, and you are going to tell those police officers outside that Grandpa authorized the charge before he passed." I stared at him, genuinely amazed by his audacity. "You want me to commit federal perjury and use my inheritance to bail you out of a felony theft charge?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Diane rushed forward, grabbing my arm with fingers that felt like iron claws. "You owe us," she hissed, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "We gave you a perfect life. If you do not write that check right now and make those officers go away, we will destroy you. We will hire the most aggressive, ruthless probate lawyers in this entire state. We will contest the amended trust. We will drag you through the court system for decades. We will tie up every single penny of that money in litigation until you are completely bankrupt from legal fees. You will never see a dime of it." I slowly pulled my arm out of my mother's painful grip. "You cannot contest a trust when you are sitting in a federal prison." "Diane," I replied smoothly. Mr. Gallagher took a step forward, his imposing presence silently reminding my parents that any physical aggression toward me would result in immediate severe legal consequences. Carter, who had been pacing nervously back and forth near a leather sofa, suddenly stopped. He tugged violently at his custom bow tie, loosening it around his neck as he tried to regain his superior golden child edge. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You really think you can pull this off?" Carter sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are nothing but a glorified calculator, Abby. You sit in a gray cubicle all day pushing buttons on an adding machine. You have absolutely no idea how the real world works. You do not know how to manage a $40 million commercial real estate empire. Grandpa was out of his mind to leave that money to a pathetic, lonely spinster. You are going to lose everything because you are completely incompetent. The sheer arrogance of his statement hung heavily in the quiet lobby. For my entire life, Carter had belittled my intelligence to make himself feel bigger. He had convinced himself that his failed startups and stolen money somehow made him a brilliant entrepreneur, while my hard-earned degrees and grueling 80-hour work weeks meant absolutely nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not get defensive. I simply smiled a cold, calculated smile that made the remaining color drain completely from my brother's face. A glorified calculator, I repeated softly, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. Well, Carter, as a glorified calculator, I happen to be incredibly good at my job. In fact, would you like to know exactly how good I am? Carter swallowed hard, taking a half step back. Your current debt-to-income ratio is sitting at exactly 412%, I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the marble floor of the lobby. You have 6 maxed-out credit cards hidden under a shell company registered in Delaware. 2 of your luxury vehicles, including the imported sports car you bragged about during the rehearsal dinner, were quietly repossessed by the bank 22 days ago. You owe the federal government over $80,000 in unpaid back taxes. And that brilliant tech startup you claim is revolutionizing the market currently has exactly $14.32 in its primary operating account. Richard and Diane stared at me in absolute horrified silence. They had known Carter was struggling, which was why they had stolen my grandfather's money to bail him out, but they clearly had no idea just how deep the hole actually was. I have not been sitting in a cubicle pushing buttons, Carter. I continued, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. I have been building a forensic financial profile on you for 6 solid months. I know every hidden account, every fraudulent loan application, and every single penny you have squandered. You do not have a real estate empire. You do not have a tech company. You do not even have enough cash to buy a fast food dinner right now. You are completely, undeniably broke. Carter opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on dry land. The grand illusion he had spent his entire adult life building had just been systematically dismantled in under 60 seconds. The silence in the lobby was deafening, broken only by the muffled sounds of police radios crackling on the other side of the frosted glass doors. Then the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels echoed from the far corner of the room. Naomi stepped completely out of the shadows. Her beautiful white wedding gown looked almost ghostly in the dim lighting of the VIP lounge. Her face was completely unreadable, a mask of absolute chilling composure. She walked slowly across the room, bypassing my parents entirely, and stopped just a few feet away from my trembling brother. She looked directly into Carter's eyes. When she spoke, her voice did not shake. It was the terrifyingly calm tone of a highly educated, fiercely intelligent woman who had just realized she was standing next to a total stranger. Carter, Naomi said quietly, her words cutting through the tension like a razor blade. If what your sister just said is a lie, tell me right now. But before you open your mouth, I want you to remember that I paid my own way through a grueling medical residency. I am an anesthesiologist. I understand complex mathematics, and I certainly know how to read a bank statement. Carter stared at his new bride, his chest heaving. Naomi, sweetheart, you have to understand, he stammered, reaching out a trembling hand toward her. It is just a temporary cash flow problem. Business is complicated. She is making it sound worse than it is. Naomi did not flinch. She did not reach out to take his hand. She simply tilted her head, her sharp eyes studying him with clinical detachment. A temporary cash flow problem. Naomi repeated, her tone turning dangerously cold. Then explain to me why a trust fund millionaire with a booming tech company has a 400% debt-to-income ratio. Explain to me why the police are waiting outside those doors to arrest you for using a stolen credit card to pay for our wedding reception. Carter let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded completely unnatural in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the VIP lobby. He reached out again, trying to wrap his hands around Naomi's arms, attempting to pull her into an intimate, reassuring embrace. But Naomi took another sharp step backward, her posture rigid, refusing to let him touch her. "Naomi, baby, you are overreacting," Carter stammered, running a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You are letting her get into your head. This is exactly what Abigail does. She is having one of her psychotic tantrums because she cannot stand the fact that I am happy and she is miserable. She probably called the police herself and made up some ridiculous story about a stolen card just to ruin the reception." Naomi stared at him, her expression completely blank. "Carter," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "The police do not dispatch multiple units to a country club for a felony grand larceny charge just because a sister is throwing a tantrum. The officer specifically said the primary account holder reported the card stolen 3 days ago. Your grandfather died last night. Are you honestly trying to tell me that Abigail hacked into a dead man's bank account, reported a card stolen retroactively, and somehow faked a 400% debt-to-income ratio on your financial records?" Carter swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he realized his usual charm was completely failing him. Naomi was not his mother. She was not going to smile, nod, and hand him a blank check. "Look, it is complicated." Carter snapped, his tone suddenly shifting from pleading to aggressive. The panic in his chest was bubbling over into anger. "You do not understand how corporate trusts work, Naomi. There are rolling accounts, equity lines, and tax loopholes. I am moving assets around. Abby just found a few outdated spreadsheets and is trying to make me look bad. Now I need you to calm down. Go back out there and wait for me in the bridal suite. This is foster family business. I will handle it." Naomi did not move a single muscle. The absolute audacity of him ordering her out of the room on their wedding day, telling her to stay out of family business just hours after they had stood at the altar and exchanged vows, was the final spark that ignited her fury. Foster family business. Naomi repeated the words, dripping with absolute venom. "We just signed a legally binding marriage certificate, Carter. In this state, that means your financial liabilities are now my financial liabilities. If you are hiding massive debts, if you are using stolen money to pay for the champagne my parents just drank, then your business is my business. I am not going to sit in a bridal suite like a naive little girl while the police wait outside to arrest my husband. I want the truth. Right now." Before Carter could formulate another lie, Diane stepped directly between them. She smoothed down the front of her ruined silk gown, lifted her chin, and looked down her nose at Naomi. All the fake warmth and welcoming smiles she had plastered on her face during the rehearsal dinner vanished completely, replaced by the cold, calculating elitism of a woman who believed her wealth made her superior to everyone else in the room. "Now, Naomi, dear, let us not become hysterical," Diane said, her voice dripping with passive-aggressive condescension. "I know you are feeling overwhelmed right now. You come from a very different background than we do, a much more modest upbringing. We understand that this level of wealth, these kinds of high-stakes financial maneuvers, can be very confusing for someone who is not used to managing millions of dollars." Naomi slowly turned her head to look at my mother. The sheer disrespect of the comment hung heavily in the air. Confusing, Naomi asked, her voice dangerously soft. "Yes, confusing." Diane continued, doubling down on her elitist attack. "Carter is an entrepreneur. He takes risks. That is how generational wealth is built. You should be supporting him, not interrogating him like a criminal. You should be grateful that we welcomed you into this family with open arms and threw you a wedding that your own parents could never have afforded in a million years. So I suggest you do exactly what your husband just told you to do. Go upstairs, fix your makeup, and let the men figure out this little banking error." The lobby fell dead silent. Even Richard looked slightly uncomfortable with how viciously his wife was attacking the bride, but he said absolutely nothing to stop it. He simply stood there waiting for Naomi to submit to the family hierarchy. Naomi took a deep breath. She looked at Diane's perfectly manicured nails, her expensive designer jewelry, and her arrogant, sneering face. "My parents are retired public school teachers, Diane." Naomi said, her voice steady and echoing with undeniable power. They could not afford $150,000 wedding. You are right about that. But they also never taught me to steal from an elderly man to pay for a party. I have zero debt. I paid off my undergraduate loans and my medical school tuition entirely on my own. I save lives for a living. Your son apparently steals from his own grandfather to lease sports cars he cannot afford, so do not ever speak to me about my background again. Diane's mouth fell open in sheer, unadulterated shock. She was completely unaccustomed to anyone standing up to her, let alone a woman she considered to be beneath her social standing. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Diane sputtered, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You ungrateful, arrogant little—" "That is enough, Diane." My voice cut through the room like a gunshot. I stepped forward, putting myself physically between my mother and Naomi. I did not even look at Diane or Richard. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Naomi, recognizing the absolute nightmare she was currently living through. I looked at the beautiful, brilliant woman who had been tricked into marrying a fraud. I saw the intelligence in her eyes, the analytical mind that was rapidly putting all the terrifying pieces together. She did not need my parents' fake approval, and she certainly did not need Carter's empty promises. What she needed was the absolute, undeniable truth. "You are a smart woman, Naomi," I said quietly, my tone completely shifting away from the combative edge I had used with my parents. My voice was calm, respectful, and entirely serious. "You paid your own way through medical school. You analyze complex risks and failing vital signs for a living. You know exactly what a sinking ship looks like." Carter lunged forward, trying to get between us. "Shut up, Abby. Do not listen to her, Naomi. She is lying. She is trying to ruin us." Mr. Gallagher immediately stepped in front of Carter, raising a single authoritative hand. "Step back, Mr. Foster," the lawyer commanded, his deep voice, leaving absolutely no room for argument. Carter froze, realizing the police were just on the other side of the glass doors. I ignored Carter completely and kept my gaze locked on Naomi. "Look at him, Naomi," I instructed gently. "Look at how he is sweating. Look at how they are both reacting. Do you really think this man paid for this wedding with his own money? Do you really think a millionaire panics over a simple banking error?" Naomi swallowed hard, a single tear finally breaking free and rolling down her cheek, ruining her perfect wedding makeup. She shook her head slowly, the devastating realization finally settling into her bones. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "No, he did not. But how do I know what is real? How do I know what he actually owes?" I reached into my designer purse. The soft rustle of the leather seemed amplified in the silent room. My fingers brushed past my wallet and my keys until they found the small metallic object I had carried with me every single day for the past 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to expose the rot hiding beneath my family's perfect facade. I pulled my hand out. Resting on my palm was a sleek black USB drive. "You do not have to take my word for it, Naomi," I said smoothly, holding the small drive out toward her. "I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in family gossip or jealous tantrums. I deal in hard, irrefutable data. Every single bank statement, every defaulted loan, every forged document, and the exact paper trail of the stolen credit card used to pay for this venue is on this drive." Naomi stared at the black USB drive resting in my hand as if it were a loaded weapon. "Take it," I urged softly. "See exactly who you just married." Carter lost his mind. He let out a guttural, animalistic sound of pure panic and lunged directly across the heavy glass coffee table. His hands clawed desperately for the small black drive in my palm. But Naomi was faster. Years of working in high-pressure emergency operating rooms had given her lightning-fast reflexes. She reached out and snatched the USB drive right out of my hand before Carter's fingers could even brush against it. "Give it to me, Naomi," Carter shouted, his voice cracking violently. He stumbled against the edge of the table, knocking over a crystal vase that shattered onto the floor. Do not plug that into your phone. It is a virus. She is trying to hack your personal accounts. Give it to me right now." Mr. Gallagher stepped smoothly between Carter and Naomi, acting as an impenetrable human shield in his tailored pinstripe suit. Richard finally realized his son was completely out of control and grabbed Carter by the shoulders, pulling him back forcefully before he could physically assault his own bride. Naomi ignored her husband's frantic screaming entirely. She opened her designer bridal clutch, pulled out a small cord adapter she kept for reviewing digital patient charts on the go, and connected the USB drive directly into her smartphone. The lobby fell into a tense, suffocating silence. The only sound was Carter's heavy, panicked breathing and the soft, rhythmic tapping of Naomi's thumb against her phone screen. The harsh blue light of the digital display illuminated her face in the dim room, casting stark shadows across her cheekbones. I watched her eyes dart rapidly back and forth across the screen as she opened the main directory folder. I had organized the files meticulously. I am a professional forensic accountant after all. Everything was categorized, highlighted, and cross-referenced with official bank statements, court summons, and collection notices. There was no room for misinterpretation. The data was absolute. Open folder number 1, Naomi. I instructed, my voice calm and completely steady against the chaos of the room. That is the primary operating account for his revolutionary tech startup, the company he told you was securing millions in venture capital. Naomi tapped the screen. She scrolled down to the bottom line of the official bank ledger. Her breath hitched. $14.32, she read aloud, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. And a notice of account closure due to insufficient funds and repeated overdraft penalties. Carter twisted against his father's grip. "It is an old account," he yelled defensively, sweat pouring down his face. "I moved the capital to offshore holdings to avoid tax penalties." She doctored that statement. She printed it off a fake website. Folder number 3. I continued, completely ignoring my brother's pathetic lies. Personal assets and vehicle loans. Naomi tapped the screen again. Her eyes widened as she read the legal notice stamped with a red seal. Notice of repossession from the state of Illinois. She read, her voice growing colder and sharper with every single word. Warrant issued for a black Porsche 911. Outstanding balance of $142,000. She looked up from the screen, her dark eyes locking onto Carter. "You told me the Porsche was in the shop getting a custom paint job. You told me you paid cash for it 6 months ago after you closed a major software deal." Carter opened his mouth to speak, but he had absolutely nothing left. The charming excuses he had used his entire life were completely useless against hard data. He just shook his head, his face slick with nervous sweat, refusing to make eye contact with the woman he had just married. Diane, unable to stand watching her golden child be interrogated and stripped of his dignity, took a step forward. "Naomi, please stop this ridiculous charade," my mother pleaded, her tone a sickening mixture of fake sweetness and rising desperation. "Every successful businessman has debts. It is called leverage. You are embarrassing him, and you are embarrassing yourself by listening to this bitter woman. Just hand the drive to Richard and let us handle this banking error as a family." Naomi did not even acknowledge my mother. She kept scrolling. Her thumb moved faster and faster as she swiped through pages of maxed-out credit cards, past due utility bills, and urgent final notices from collection agencies. The grand illusion of the wealthy, sophisticated entrepreneur she had fallen in love with was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. It was being rapidly replaced by the horrifying reality of a desperate broke con artist who had lied to her about absolutely everything. Then she clicked on the final folder. I had labeled it simply as high-priority liabilities. I watched Naomi open the first PDF document inside that folder. For a few agonizing seconds, she just stared at it. The scrolling stopped completely. Her body went entirely rigid, as if she had just been struck by lightning. The warm brown tone of her skin turned ashen, the color draining completely from her beautiful face, leaving her looking physically ill. "Naomi," I asked softly, stepping slightly closer, "are you seeing the commercial loan document?" Naomi did not answer me right away. She slowly raised her head. Her phone was trembling violently in her hand. The expression on her face had shifted from shock to anger, and finally to absolute unadulterated horror. She looked at Carter as if she were staring at a terrifying monster she had never met before in her life. "Carter," Naomi whispered. Her voice was so quiet, so fragile, it barely carried across the room. But the sheer terror vibrating in her tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Carter shrank back against his father, knowing exactly what she had just opened. He closed his eyes tightly, turning his face toward the wall, completely unable to look at her. Naomi took a slow, agonizing step forward. She turned the bright screen of her phone around so Carter and Richard could both see the bold black text of the banking document. "Carter, why am I looking at a commercial real estate loan document?" Richard let out a sharp gasp, letting go of Carter's shoulders. He stepped forward, his eyes squinting to read the screen. Even my father had not known about the massive scale of this specific document. Diane covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized just how deep the financial grave her son had dug actually was. "Why am I looking at a defaulted loan for $3 million? Naomi repeated, her voice rising in pitch, the fragile whisper breaking into a sound of pure devastation. I looked at the date on the top right corner of the document. "He secured that loan 8 months ago, Naomi," I explained calmly, making sure she understood the exact timeline of his betrayal. "Right around the time you two got engaged." Naomi's eyes darted frantically across the digital page, reading the fine print of the banking contract. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. "You told me to sign a stack of insurance liability waivers for your company's new health plan," she stammered, her voice shaking with the realization. "We were sitting at my kitchen table. You slipped this in. You copied my electronic signature." "He did not just copy it, Naomi," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin. "He had a corrupt notary public on his payroll certify it, a notary who is currently under federal investigation by the Financial Crimes Division. The bank issued the $3 million to keep his fake company afloat, and they used your pristine credit score and medical license as the ultimate collateral." Carter kept his eyes squeezed shut, leaning heavily against the wall as if his legs could no longer support his own weight. "I am sorry," he whimpered, a pathetic, cowardly sound that echoed terribly in the opulent room. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed the capital to cover the margins on a bad investment. I was going to use Grandpa's trust fund money to clear the entire balance tomorrow morning. I swear to God, Naomi, I was going to fix it before the bank ever contacted you." Naomi stared at him, the tears of betrayal instantly drying up, replaced by a raging inferno of self-preservation and absolute fury. She realized in that exact moment that the man she loved had not just lied to her. He had intentionally served her up on a silver platter to federal debt collectors to save his own skin. "You forged my name!" Naomi screamed, the sound tearing through the VIP lobby with enough force to rattle the heavy frosted glass doors. "You forged my name on a $3 million loan." The echo of Naomi screaming about the forged signature seemed to shake the very foundations of the country club lobby. Carter flinched violently, raising his hands, as if he could physically block the sound of his own guilt. "Naomi, please listen to me," Carter begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I was desperate. The venture capital firm pulled their funding at the last minute. The bank was going to seize the company assets. My father could not remortgage the house again because his credit was already overextended. I just needed bridge capital to survive until the trust transferred to me." Naomi stared at him with absolute disgust. "Bridge capital? You stole my identity. You used my medical license and my pristine credit score to secure a $3 million loan without my knowledge. That is not bridge capital, Carter. That is a major federal crime." Richard stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture, completely failing to read the room. Now, Naomi, let us not use words like crime. We had a solid financial strategy. The grandfather's trust was legally supposed to transfer to Carter today. We were going to wire the funds to the commercial bank first thing Monday morning to clear the entire balance. The account would have been settled. You never even would have known the loan existed. Naomi slowly turned her head to look at my father. The absolute horror on her face deepened. You knew about this? She asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Both of you knew your son forged my signature on a commercial banking document, and you stood there in the front row today and smiled while I walked down that aisle. Diane rushed forward, her fake maternal instincts kicking into overdrive. She reached out, trying to grab Naomi's hands. We did it to protect you, sweetheart. Diane pleaded, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. We did not want to burden you with stressful business details right before the wedding. You are part of the foster family now. We protect our own. Families make sacrifices for each other. You just need to take a deep breath, put that phone away, and let us handle the lawyers. Do not touch me. Naomi hissed violently, pulling her hands away from my mother. Naomi took a deliberate step back from all of them. Her chest was heaving, but her eyes were remarkably clear. The shock had completely burned away, leaving nothing but cold, hard clarity. She reached up to the back of her head, her fingers gripping the expensive, intricate lace veil that Diane had insisted she wear. With one sharp, aggressive pull, Naomi ripped the veil from her hair, tearing the expensive diamond pins out with it. She let the white lace fall carelessly to the floor, stepping directly on it with her high heels. Then she looked down at her left hand. She stared at the massive, glittering diamond engagement ring that Carter had given her. The ring he had sworn was a family heirloom, but which my spreadsheets clearly proved was financed on yet another maxed-out credit card. Naomi grabbed the ring, twisted it off her finger, and threw it as hard as she could directly at Carter's chest. The heavy ring struck his tuxedo lapel with a sharp thud and bounced off, skittering across the marble floor until it hit the baseboard. Carter scrambled after it like a desperate dog chasing a bone, falling to his hands and knees. I am not your family, Naomi stated, her voice echoing with undeniable power and absolute finality. I am a victim of identity theft. I am calling my lawyer the second I walk out of this room. I am filing for an immediate annulment first thing Monday morning. This marriage is completely over. Carter looked up from the floor, still clutching the diamond ring in his sweaty palm. No, Naomi, please. You cannot leave me. I love you. You do not love me, Carter. Naomi replied, her tone completely devoid of any affection. You loved my credit score. You loved the fact that marrying a doctor made you look successful to your country club friends. But the charade is over. And when I walk out of those glass doors right now, I am handing this USB drive directly to the police officers waiting in the hallway. I am pressing full criminal charges against you for fraud and identity theft. Carter let out a loud, pathetic sob. He crawled toward her on the marble floor, completely abandoning whatever shreds of dignity he had left. You cannot do that, he cried, grabbing the hem of her white wedding dress. If you give them that drive, they will send me to federal prison. You will ruin my life. Naomi looked down at him with an expression of pure ice. You ruined your own life, Carter. I am just providing the documentation. She violently yanked her dress out of his grasp, turning her back on him completely. She walked over to stand right next to Mr. Gallagher, seeking the only safe space in the entire room. Seeing her golden child crying on the floor, completely broken and facing imminent arrest, Diane entirely lost her mind. She could not manipulate Naomi. She could not intimidate the lawyer. So she turned her absolute unhinged wrath toward the one person she had always successfully bullied. Me. Diane lunged across the room, her face contorted in pure rage. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at my face. This is all your fault, she screamed, her shrill voice vibrating off the glass walls of the lobby. I did not flinch. I simply stared back at her, waiting for the inevitable mental gymnastics she would use to blame me for her son's felony. You planned this from the very beginning. Diane shrieked, tears of fury finally spilling down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. You could not stand the fact that Carter found a beautiful, successful woman. You could not stand seeing him happy. You compiled those terrible spreadsheets and you waited until his wedding day to ambush him. You destroyed his marriage on purpose because you are a sick, jealous monster. My mother was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stepped even closer, invading my personal space. But she was not done. She still believed deep down in her delusional core that she held the ultimate authority in our relationship. She still believed I was the obedient scapegoat who would eventually cave under enough pressure. "You are going to fix this," Diane commanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, demanding growl. "You have the trust documents in your hand. You have complete control over $40 million of our family money. I do not care what your grandfather wrote in that. Well, you are going to call the bank right now. You are going to authorize an immediate wire transfer from the trust to clear that $3 million commercial loan. You are going to write a check to the venue manager to pay off this reception, and you are going to pay whatever it takes to make Naomi drop these ridiculous charges." Diane stood up perfectly straight, crossing her arms over her chest, glaring at me with arrogant expectation. "You are going to write the check right now, Abigail, or I swear to you, I will make sure you never have a moment of peace for the rest of your natural life." I looked at my mother, watching her face twist into a mask of completely unhinged desperation. She stood there in her ruined designer gown, demanding that I use my inheritance to bail her precious son out of a federal crime. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not back away. I simply shook my head, my expression carved out of solid ice. "I am not writing a check, Diane," I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the marble floor of the VIP lobby. "I am not spending a single penny of Grandpa Harrison's money to finance Carter's felonies. You built this house of cards entirely on your own. You forged the signatures. You stole the credit cards. You can rot in the consequences." Diane let out a piercing shriek of pure frustration. She raised her hands as if she were actually going to strike me, completely losing whatever shred of country club refinement she had left. But before she could take another step forward, a harsh, grating laugh cut through the tension in the room. It was Richard. He was standing near a plush leather sofa, suddenly completely devoid of the panic that had consumed him just moments ago. He straightened his silk tie, rolled his shoulders back, and aggressively cleared his throat. The terrified father facing a police interrogation was gone instantly, replaced by the arrogant, ruthless corporate executive I had known and despised my entire life. "Enough, Diane," Richard ordered, waving his hand dismissively at his wife. He did not even look at her. His eyes were locked entirely on me. "Stop begging her. You are humiliating yourself for absolutely no reason. We do not need her permission, we do not need her forgiveness, and we certainly do not need her money." Diane froze, looking at her husband in total confusion. Carter sniffled from the corner, wiping his sweaty face with his sleeve, staring at his father with a desperate glimmer of hope. Richard casually walked over to the heavy mahogany side table where he had placed his leather briefcase earlier that afternoon. He snapped the solid brass locks open, the sharp metallic click echoing loudly in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, slightly yellowed legal document secured inside a protective plastic sleeve. He held it up to the dim light of the chandelier, admiring it for a moment, before slamming it down onto the glass coffee table right next to my black USB drive. "Do you really think I would leave my family's financial future entirely in the hands of an unpredictable, senile old man?" Richard sneered, directing his arrogant gaze toward Mr. Gallagher. "Or worse, do you think I would let it fall to a bitter, ungrateful daughter who has spent her entire life jealous of her brother's success?" Mr. Gallagher stepped forward, his posture remaining perfectly rigid and professional. He glanced down at the document on the table, his sharp legal mind instantly recognizing the heavily stamped state seals on the parchment. Richard picked the document back up and waved it in the air like a conquering general holding a captured flag. "This, gentleman, is a durable, broad power of attorney. It is signed, properly notarized, and completely legally binding." He looked at me, a wicked, triumphant smile spreading across his face. I had my father sign this 5 years ago when he was in the intensive care unit recovering from his second hip replacement. He was 80 years old, heavily medicated on strong painkillers, completely exhausted, and thought he was just signing a massive stack of standard hospital discharge papers. I slipped this document right into the middle of the pile. He never even read it. He just blindly signed exactly where I pointed. Naomi let out a sharp, audible gasp of pure disgust. She was a medical professional who dedicated her life to caring for vulnerable patients. Hearing a man brag about manipulating a heavily medicated senior citizen in a hospital bed made her physically recoil. "You tricked your own father while he was under medical care," she whispered, her voice laced with absolute revulsion. "You committed elder abuse just to get your hands on his bank accounts. I secured my legacy." Richard snapped back, entirely unashamed of his own moral bankruptcy. My father was getting old and weak. He was losing his edge. Someone needed to take permanent control of the family assets before he squandered them. This document gives me absolute uncontested authority over every single bank account, property deed, and investment portfolio in Harrison Foster's name. It grants me the power to liquidate assets, sign contracts, and authorize massive wire transfers without ever needing approval from a judge, a lawyer, or an estranged granddaughter. Richard turned his full, arrogant attention back to me. He took a slow, intimidating step forward. "Your little trust document might name you as the official executor, Abigail, but probate takes weeks, sometimes months, to fully process through the state courts. This power of attorney gives me direct, unfiltered access to the capital right now. Today. It completely supersedes whatever cute little legal maneuver you thought you pulled by turning my father against me in his final hours." He tapped the document aggressively with his index finger. "By the time you even manage to file that trust paperwork with the probate court on Monday morning, the accounts will be entirely empty. I am going to drain every single liquid asset he possessed." Hearing this, Carter practically collapsed against the wall in sheer relief. The heavy, suffocating threat of federal prison suddenly lifted from his shoulders. He wiped his sweaty face, a weak, pathetic smile returning to his lips. "Thank God," Carter breathed out, looking at Richard like a savior. "You are going to fix it, Dad. You are going to pay off the commercial loan." "That is exactly what I am going to do, Carter," Richard replied confidently. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He unlocked the screen, swiped past his messages, and tapped deliberately on his VIP contacts list. "I am calling my private wealth manager at the bank," Richard announced, making sure his voice carried clearly to every single person in the room. "I am going to authorize an immediate, irrevocable wire transfer of $3 million from my father's primary holding account directly to the commercial lender. Carter's debt will be cleared immediately. The forged signature will become a non-issue because the bank will have their money. By the time those police officers outside the doors finish writing up their preliminary report, this entire nightmare will be completely resolved." Diane let out a loud, shuddering breath of relief, pressing her hands to her chest. She looked at me with a smug, vindictive smirk, fully believing that they had just checkmated me. Richard tapped the call button, but he did not put the phone to his ear. Instead, he aggressively pressed the speakerphone icon and turned the volume all the way up. He wanted everyone in the VIP lobby to hear his absolute victory. He wanted me to hear him dismantle my 3 years of meticulous forensic accounting in real time. He held the phone out in the empty space between us. The dial tone began to ring, echoing loudly and rhythmically in the tense, silent air of the room. Ring, ring, ring. Richard locked his eyes entirely onto mine. His expression was a portrait of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He believed he was the smartest man in the world. He believed that his wealth, his gender, and his complete lack of a moral compass made him completely untouchable. He leaned in closer to me, the phone still ringing loudly in his hand, and dropped his voice to a menacing, triumphant whisper. "I am transferring the funds right now. You lose, Abigail. You always lose." The ringing stopped with a sharp electronic click. A polished professional voice echoed from the small speaker of my father's phone, filling the tense silence of the VIP lobby. Good afternoon, Chase Executive Wealth Management. This is William speaking. This line is on a recorded network. How may I provide you with exceptional service today? Richard puffed out his chest, his arrogant posture returning in full force. He held the phone out toward me, his eyes practically gleaming with vindictive triumph. William. This is Richard Foster. My secure voice verification PIN is 4829. I am calling to execute an immediate, irrevocable wire transfer. I am invoking my durable power of attorney over the Harrison Foster primary trust accounts. Certainly, Mr. Foster, the banker replied, the sound of rapid keyboard typing echoing through the speaker. Please allow me one moment to pull up the master financial profile. Richard smiled a cruel, cold smile. He looked over at Diane, who had finally stopped crying and was now smoothing down her ruined silk gown with a smug expression. Carter leaned against the wall, taking deep, shaky breaths, fully believing that his father was about to wave a magic wand and make his federal crimes disappear. Naomi stood completely still next to Mr. Gallagher, her arms crossed, watching the spectacle with the detached, analytical gaze of a doctor observing a terminal patient. I did not break eye contact with my father. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I just waited. Mr. Foster Williams said, his voice returning to the line. The smooth, rehearsed corporate tone had suddenly vanished. He sounded noticeably tense, his words carefully measured. I have the master profile open. Sir, I cannot authorize any wire transfers from this account. Richard frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in aggressive confusion. Excuse me. He barked, his authoritative persona instantly slipping into irritation. What do you mean you cannot authorize it? I just told you I am holding the durable power of attorney. I have unrestricted proxy access. You have processed these transfers for me before. I understand that, Sir William replied, his voice wavering slightly under my father's anger. But the system is showing a hard legal lock on all of Harrison Foster's liquid assets and property deeds. Your power of attorney has been officially flagged as permanently revoked. Richard let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. Revoked. That is impossible. My father is dead. He passed away at 1 o'clock this morning. He could not have revoked anything. There is a technical error in your system, William. I suggest you override it immediately before I call the branch manager and have you fired. It is not a technical error, Mr. Foster Williams stammered, the typing on his end growing louder and more frantic. The revocation was not filed this morning. It was filed yesterday afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock. A senior partner from Gallagher and Associates physically submitted a court-ordered mandate directly to our legal department. The mandate was signed by Harrison Foster, verified by 2 independent medical doctors, confirming his mental competency, and sealed by a state judge. Mr. Gallagher stepped smoothly into the center of the room, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He leaned down slightly toward the phone in Richard's trembling hand. Good afternoon, William. This is Thomas Gallagher. Good afternoon, Mr. Gallagher. The banker replied immediately, the sheer relief of having a competent legal authority on the line palpable in his voice. I am looking at your filings right now. Everything is perfectly in order on our end. Gallagher stood up straight, towering over my father. Your durable power of attorney is nothing but a piece of historical scrap paper, Richard the lawyer stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority. My firm spent the last 48 hours quietly locking down every single bank account, stock portfolio, and property deed attached to your father's name. You have zero access to the trust. You cannot move a single penny. Diane let out a weak, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth as the reality of the situation finally penetrated her deep delusion. The $40 million was actually gone. They were entirely cut off. Richard stared at the phone in his hand as if it had just caught fire. The veins in his neck bulged, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. The realization that he had been completely outplayed by an old man in a hospital bed and a daughter he despised was shattering his mind. But the threat of the police waiting right outside the lobby doors forced him to violently suppress his shock. He had to pivot. He had to save himself. Fine. Richard yelled into the phone, spit flying from his lips. Freeze the trust. I do not care. Pull the money from my personal executive accounts. Use my primary residence in the Fairfield gated community as collateral if you have to. I need $3 million transferred to the commercial lending division right now to clear Carter Foster's corporate loan. Just pay the debt and close the file. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. The typing stopped entirely. Mr. Foster Williams said softly, the tone of his voice indicating he was about to deliver catastrophic news. I am looking at the commercial loan file right now. I cannot transfer funds to clear that debt. Why not? Richard roared, completely losing his mind. I am offering you direct collateral. Take the house. Take my personal savings. Just pay the commercial loan before the police file their report. I cannot pay the loan because our bank no longer owns it. William explained his words, dropping like heavy stones into the silent room. What are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. You cannot sell a loan without notifying the primary account holder. We can when the loan enters severe default and is flagged by the Federal Fraud Division for a forged signature. William stated, his corporate politeness finally cracking under the sheer weight of my family's criminal activity. The Commercial Lending Division flagged Carter Foster's account for critical risk late last night. To mitigate our institutional exposure, the bank packaged that specific debt and sold it off at a massive discount this morning, the moment the financial markets opened. Carter let out a pathetic whimper, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the marble floor, completely defeated. Naomi stared down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Sold it to who? Richard demanded, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. Who bought the debt? Give me the name of the buyer right now. I will call them myself and negotiate a settlement. William let out a heavy sigh. It was sold to a private financial holding company, Mr. Foster. And sir, I am looking at the legal alerts attached to your personal profile. Because you co-signed certain corporate credit lines for your son tying your personal assets to his business ventures, this holding company has enormous leverage over you. What kind of leverage? Diane shrieked, completely unable to control herself anymore. What are you saying? I am saying, Mrs. Foster, that the holding company did not buy the debt to negotiate. William explained, delivering the absolute final blow. They bought it to execute the default clauses. They filed the paperwork with the county clerk exactly 1 hour ago. They have initiated an immediate aggressive foreclosure on your primary residence in Fairfield. They have also placed hard liens on your luxury vehicles and your country club shares. The lobby was completely dead silent. You could hear the faint, distant sound of the police officers' radios crackling on the other side of the frosted glass doors. William cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Foster, I am deeply sorry, but according to this system alert, as of an hour ago, you are officially facing eviction. The holding company owns everything you have. Is there anything else I can assist you with today? Richard did not answer. His fingers went entirely numb. The expensive smartphone slipped from his grasp, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of broken glass. The call disconnected, leaving only the deafening silence of total ruin. Diane stared blankly at the wall. The massive, sprawling colonial home with the manicured lawn and the heated pool. The fortress of perfection she had used to judge the rest of the world. It was gone. Her designer clothes, her cars, her elite status. Everything was gone. Richard slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, vacant, and completely broken. The arrogant corporate executive was dead. He was just a terrified, bankrupt man facing the absolute destruction of his entire life. Who? Richard choked out, his voice barely a whisper. What holding company would buy a fraudulent commercial loan just to destroy me? I did not say a word. I simply uncrossed my arms, reached into my designer purse, and pulled out my own smartphone. I unlocked the screen, opening the official state corporate registry application. I tapped the screen once, bringing up the certified ownership documents for the private holding company I had secretly established exactly 1 year ago. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between us. I held the phone up right in front of my father's face. The screen glowed brightly in the dim light of the VIP lobby. Right at the top of the legal document listed as the sole proprietor, chief executive officer, and absolute owner of the holding company was my name, Abigail Foster. I looked at my father, a genuine radiant smile finally breaking across my face. I looked at the man who had treated me like a disposable bank account for 35 years. I own the holding company, Dad. I said, my voice echoing with the sweet, absolute satisfaction of total victory. And it looks like you owe me $3 million. Richard stared at the glowing screen of my smartphone as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable corporate titan who had spent 35 years dictating every aspect of my life was completely paralyzed by a single piece of digital paper. He reached out a trembling, sweaty hand, his fingers twitching, as if he wanted to snatch the phone away and smash it against the marble floor right next to his own broken device. Mr. Gallagher smoothly stepped into the space between us. He did not say a word, but his imposing physical presence and the hard, uncompromising look in his eyes made my father freeze. Richard slowly lowered his hand, the reality of his absolute defeat finally crushing the last remaining ounce of fight out of his body. "That is impossible," Richard finally choked out, his voice hoarse and ragged. "You do not have that kind of money. You are just a mid-level accountant. You do not have $3 million lying around to buy a commercial banking loan." I lowered my phone and slipped it calmly back into my purse. "I did not need $3 million, Dad," I replied, my tone conversational and completely devoid of sympathy. Banks do not want to hold on to toxic, fraudulent debt. It hurts their quarterly margins and exposes them to massive federal liability. When a loan enters severe default and is flagged for criminal forgery, the bank rushes to offload it to private collectors for pennies on the dollar. I bought your entire massive, suffocating debt portfolio for exactly $850,000 in cash. Diane gasped, her hands flying to her throat. $800,000? She shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the frosted glass walls. "Where did you get that kind of money?" "I got it from you, Diane," I answered, turning my gaze to my mother. "I got it by taking every single penny you demanded I give to Carter over the last 5 years and putting it into high-yield investment accounts instead. I saved the money I refused to spend on his failed startups. I saved the money I refused to use for his extravagant vacations. And I took the massive performance bonuses I earned by working 80-hour weeks at my firm, the exact same job Carter called a glorified calculator, and I built a fortress with it. You funded your own destruction by constantly demanding I finance his life. I just finally decided to make a different investment." Richard stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the leather sofa. He collapsed onto the cushions, his face completely pale. "You bought the debt," he muttered, staring blankly at the floor. "You bought the loan." "Yes, Richard," I said, stepping closer so he could hear every single word with crystal clarity. "I own the debt, which means I own the collateral you so arrogantly tied to it. When you co-signed Carter's corporate credit lines, you used your primary residence as the ultimate guarantee. You used the equity in the Fairfield house. You used the titles to your luxury cars. You even pledged your exclusive shares in this exact country club. Every single asset you own is legally bound to the holding company that I control. And as your banker just confirmed, I initiated the foreclosure this morning. The county sheriff will be placing the eviction notice on your front door by Monday afternoon." Diane let out a terrifying, animalistic wail. She rushed over to Richard, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him violently. "Do something," she screamed at him. Her perfectly styled hair completely ruined her expensive silk dress, stained with sweat and spilled champagne. "Call our lawyers. We will file for bankruptcy. We will declare Chapter 11 tomorrow morning. We will reorganize the assets and protect the house. She cannot take our home." I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that made Diane flinch. You really should have consulted a real attorney before you decided to dabble in federal felonies. Diane, I said, gesturing toward Mr. Gallagher, who nodded slightly in agreement. Bankruptcy is a legal shield designed to protect honest people who fall on hard times. It allows legitimate businesses to reorganize their debts. But there is a very specific ironclad clause in the federal bankruptcy code that you completely overlooked. I turned my attention to Carter, who was still sitting on the marble floor, hugging his knees to his chest like a frightened child. Debts obtained through malicious fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft are strictly non-dischargeable. I explained, my voice ringing with absolute uncompromising authority. Because Carter forged Naomi's signature to secure the initial funds, and because you, Richard, knowingly authorized the use of those stolen funds, this is no longer a simple banking error. It is a documented financial crime. No bankruptcy judge in the entire country will grant you protection from a debt born out of felony forgery. You cannot wipe the slate clean. You cannot reorganize. You owe me the full $3 million, and I am going to liquidate every single thing you own to recoup my investment. The absolute finality of my words landed like a physical blow to the room. The legal trap was completely flawless. I had spent months reviewing every single statute, every property deed, and every financial loophole they could possibly try to use to escape. I had built a perfectly woven web of data contracts and irrefutable evidence, and they had walked directly into the center of it, entirely blinded by their own arrogance and greed. Naomi stood near the heavy oak side table, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with cold, calculated vindication. She looked at me, giving a slow, deeply respectful nod. She understood exactly what I had done. I had not just saved her from financial ruin. I had handed her the ultimate sword to sever her ties with this deeply toxic family forever. Carter slowly raised his head from his knees. His custom-tailored tuxedo was wrinkled and covered in dust from crawling on the floor. The diamond engagement ring he had desperately chased down was still clutched in his trembling hand, totally useless. He looked at his father, the powerful executive who had bailed him out of every single mistake he had ever made since childhood. Richard was staring blankly at the wall, completely unresponsive, entirely broken by the realization that his wealth and his legacy were completely gone. Carter looked at his mother. Diane was sobbing hysterically into her hands, mourning the loss of her sprawling colonial home, her heated swimming pool, and her elite social status. She was not crying for her son. She was crying for the affluent lifestyle that was being ripped away from her. Finally, Carter looked at Naomi, the beautiful, brilliant, self-made woman he had tried to trap in his web of lies. Naomi did not offer him a single ounce of pity. She simply turned her back on him, picking up her designer clutch from the table, preparing to walk out of the room and out of his life forever. The grand illusion was entirely shattered. The golden child was completely stripped of his armor. There were no more trust funds to drain. There were no more credit cards to max out. There was no more stolen inheritance to rely on. Carter let out a hollow, agonizing gasp. The sheer weight of reality finally crashed down on his shoulders. He had absolutely nothing left. He had no money to his name. He had no wife to support his facade. He did not even have his parents' wealthy basement to retreat to because they were about to be evicted from their own home. His legs completely gave out beneath him. Carter slumped forward, falling heavily onto his knees right in the middle of the opulent VIP lobby. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently, as he surrendered to the absolute destruction of his own making. Carter remained completely crumpled on the marble floor of the VIP lobby, his pathetic sobs echoing in the suffocating silence of the room. The absolute reality of his financial and social annihilation had finally broken him. I stood there looking down at the brother I had been forced to sacrifice my entire life for, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. Diane slowly turned her head away from her broken golden child and looked at me. I could see the exact moment her mind calculated the total shift in power. Her aggressive, elitist posturing vanished in a fraction of a second. The venomous woman who had just demanded I use my inheritance to bail out a federal felony was gone. In her place stood a desperate, terrified woman who suddenly realized her hated daughter was the only person standing between her and utter homelessness. Diane's lower lip began to quiver. Tears, large and heavy, welled up in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her ruined designer makeup. She let out a loud, theatrical sob, pressing her hands to her chest as if her heart were physically breaking. She took a slow, wobbly step toward me, reaching her arms out in a desperate plea for physical contact. "Abby, my sweet baby girl." Diane wept, her voice trembling with a perfectly manufactured, heartbreaking fragility. "Please, you have to stop this. I know we have made mistakes. I know we have not always been fair to you. But we are your family. We are your blood. You cannot leave your father and me out on the street. You cannot let them send your brother to a federal prison. Please, Abby, I am begging you as your mother, have mercy on us." She lunged forward, attempting to throw her arms around my neck and pull me into a tight, desperate hug. She wanted to bridge the massive canyon between us with a single manipulative embrace. She wanted to use the primal instinct of a daughter seeking her mother's comfort to completely erase 35 years of emotional abuse. I stepped back so quickly and sharply that my high heels cracked like a gunshot against the marble floor. "Do not touch me," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it contained a lethal, freezing edge that made Diane physically recoil. Her arms dropped to her sides, her fake tears stalling as she stared at me in shock. "You are not crying for Carter, Diane," I stated, systematically tearing down her pathetic performance. "You are not crying because you suddenly realize you failed me as a mother. You are crying because you are about to lose your country club membership. You are crying because your wealthy suburban friends are going to read about your grand larceny in the local newspaper tomorrow morning. You do not love me. You love the safety net I just ripped out from under you." Diane gasped, clutching her ruined silk gown. "How can you say that to me?" she wailed, trying to reignite the victim narrative. "I raised you. I gave you a home. We are family, Abigail. Family forgives. You have to show us a little bit of mercy." "Mercy," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue, as if it were a foreign language. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that made Richard flinch from his spot on the leather sofa. "Do you really want to talk to me about mercy right now, Diane? Let us talk about your version of mercy. Let us talk about Christmas Eve exactly 5 years ago." The color completely drained from Diane's face. She knew exactly what I was about to say. She opened her mouth to interrupt me, to twist the story, but I took a dominant step forward, forcing her to listen. "It was 10 degrees outside," I said, making sure my voice projected clearly across the room so Naomi and Mr. Gallagher could hear every single devastating detail. The wind chill was well below zero, and the Chicago snow was coming down in sheets. Carter had just wrecked his second car, and he threw a massive temper tantrum because he wanted a brand new luxury Audi lease. But his credit was entirely trashed. "You called me into the living room while the fireplace was roaring and the Christmas tree was glowing, and you handed me the dealership paperwork. You told me it was my duty as a sister to co-sign a $60,000 lease for a brother who did not even have a job." Carter squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, unable to endure the recounting of his own toxic entitlement. And for the first time in my life, I said no. I continued, my gaze locked entirely on my mother's terrified eyes. "I told you I could not afford the liability. Do you remember what you did next, Diane? Because I remember every single second of it." Diane shook her head rapidly, backing away from me. "Abby, please do not do this right now. We were angry. It was a misunderstanding. You walked upstairs to my childhood bedroom," I said, my voice rising in power, completely drowning out her pathetic excuses. "You pulled heavy black garbage bags from the kitchen pantry. You stuffed every single piece of clothing I owned, my winter coats, my boots, my accounting textbooks, into those bags, and you dragged them out the front door and threw them directly into the snowbank at the end of the driveway. You locked the deadbolt, turned off the porch light, and you left me standing on the freezing pavement in nothing but a light sweater. The VIP lobby was dead silent. Naomi stood near the frosted glass doors, her hands covering her mouth, absolutely horrified by the sheer cruelty of the story. She finally understood exactly why I was dismantling this family with such cold, calculated precision. I had to drag those frozen garbage bags 3 blocks to a gas station just to call a cab. I whispered, the memory of that bitter, biting cold still lingering in my bones. I spent Christmas Eve sleeping in the back seat of my beat-up sedan in a dark Walmart parking lot, shivering so violently I thought my ribs were going to crack. I stayed awake all night, terrified that I was going to freeze to death, while you, Richard, and Carter sat around a warm fire opening expensive presents paid for with stolen money. I took one final step toward my mother, invading her space, forcing her to look directly into the eyes of the daughter she had thrown away. You did not have mercy when I slept in my car in freezing temperatures, Diane. I delivered the final crushing blow. Do not ask for it now. Diane collapsed. She did not physically fall to the floor, but her spirit completely shattered. She wrapped her arms around her own stomach, bending forward as if she had just been stabbed. She realized with absolute certainty that there was no love left inside of me to exploit. She had burned the bridge to the ground 5 years ago, and now she was trapped on the wrong side of the fire. Naomi took a deep, steadying breath. She had heard enough. She had seen exactly what kind of monsters she had almost permanently tied her life to. Without saying a single word to Carter, Richard, or Diane, Naomi turned around and pushed open one of the heavy frosted glass doors leading out into the main hallway. The 2 police officers were standing right there, waiting patiently for the family drama to conclude. Naomi walked directly up to the lead officer. She held out her smartphone, the screen still glowing with the digital banking files, and handed him the black USB drive I had given her. She spoke to the officer in a low, rapid, incredibly serious voice. She pointed specifically at the screen, tapping the forged commercial loan document. I watched the lead officer's expression change instantly. The mild irritation of dealing with a wealthy country club dispute vanished. He was looking at concrete, irrefutable evidence of a massive federal felony. The officer nodded sharply to Naomi, unclipped his radio from his heavy utility belt, and requested immediate backup for a high-priority financial crimes arrest. Suddenly, the dim interior of the country club lobby was violently illuminated. Fierce, strobing flashes of red and blue light pierced through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the front driveway. The harsh, rotating colors bounced off the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors, casting long, terrifying shadows across my parents' faces. Multiple police cruisers were pulling up directly outside the main entrance, their sirens briefly blipping to part the crowd of lingering wedding guests. The heavy mahogany doors swung completely open. The lead officer stepped back into the VIP lobby, his partner right beside him. Their casual demeanor was entirely gone. They moved with the swift, uncompromising authority of the law. The officer's hand was resting firmly on the heavy metal handcuffs holstered at his waist. He looked directly past Diane's ruined dress and Richard's terrified face, locking his eyes entirely onto the groom, still kneeling on the floor. Carter looked up from the cold marble floor, his tear-stained face drained of whatever color it had left the moment his eyes locked onto the heavy metal handcuffs resting firmly on the officer's hip. In that split second, the primal instinct of a cornered animal completely took over. He did not think about his sobbing mother. He did not think about his father's ruined legacy. He did not even think about the beautiful bride standing just a few feet away. He only thought about saving his own skin from federal prison. With a sudden, desperate burst of frantic energy, Carter scrambled to his feet. His expensive leather dress shoes slipped wildly against the polished floor, but he managed to catch his balance. He spun around, completely turning his back on the police officers, and sprinted directly toward the heavy wooden service doors at the back of the VIP lounge. Those doors led straight out to the golf course and the valet parking lot. He was going to run. But Carter had entirely underestimated the woman he had tried to deceive. Naomi was already standing near the back of the room. She saw his eyes dart toward the exit a fraction of a second before he actually moved. As Carter launched himself toward the doors, Naomi took 2 deliberate steps to her left, planting herself squarely in the center of his escape route. She crossed her arms over her chest, her posture as rigid and unyielding as a steel beam. "Move, Naomi!" Carter screamed, his voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. "Get out of my way!" He did not slow down. He charged at her, fully intending to physically shove his own bride aside to escape federal custody. But Naomi did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward. She stood her ground with the fierce, uncompromising strength of a woman who had clawed her way through every obstacle life had ever thrown at her. "You are not running away from this, Carter," Naomi stated, her voice slicing through his panic like a surgical blade. "You are going to stand right here and face exactly what you did." Carter reached out, grabbing her shoulders to violently force her out of the way. But that momentary delay was all the police needed. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of the officer's boots rapidly closed the distance across the room. Before Carter could push Naomi aside, 2 massive hands clamped down onto the shoulders of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. The lead officer spun Carter around with absolute crushing force. Carter let out a high-pitched yelp as the officer shoved him face-first against the thick, frosted glass wall of the lobby. The impact rattled the heavy glass panes. Carter's cheek pressed hard against the cold surface, his arms violently yanked behind his back. Carter Foster, the lead officer, barked, his voice echoing with the full, terrifying weight of the law. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, felony forgery, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Carter's wrists sounded like a vault door slamming shut. It was the sound of his entire privileged, arrogant life coming to an abrupt, permanent end. Carter squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving against the glass. He began to sob uncontrollably, a wet, pathetic sound that filled the quiet room. "Please," Carter begged, his voice muffled against the wall. "Please do not do this. My dad will pay you. He will pay the bank. Just let me go." Diane finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. She lunged forward, her arms reaching out frantically toward her son. "You cannot take him!" she shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "He is a good boy. He was just confused. You are making a terrible mistake." The second officer instantly stepped into her path, holding up a firm, warning hand that stopped my mother dead in her tracks. "Step back right now, ma'am," the partner ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Do not interfere with a felony arrest, or you will be leaving this building in the back of a squad car right next to him." Diane looked frantically at Richard, expecting the powerful patriarch to step in and bully the police into submission. "Richard, do something," she cried out. "Tell them who you are. Call the mayor. Call the chief of police." But Richard did not move. He stood completely frozen near the leather sofa, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He knew the mayor could not save him. He knew the chief of police could not unforge a federal banking document. His massive financial empire was entirely gone, and his golden boy was going to federal prison. There was no one left to bribe. The lead officer yanked Carter away from the glass wall, turning him around to face the room. The visual contrast was absolutely stunning. Here was the family favorite wearing a $10,000 custom tuxedo with a fresh white rose pinned to his lapel, his hands securely locked in heavy steel cuffs. The officer firmly gripped Carter's bicep and marched him directly past his weeping mother and his completely broken father. As they walked past me, Carter lifted his tear-stained face. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound disbelief. The sister he had mocked, belittled, and used as a financial punching bag for 3 decades had just single-handedly dismantled his entire existence. I did not look away. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I just watched the officers drag him through the heavy mahogany doors and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the country club parking lot. The doors clicked shut, leaving the VIP lobby in a deafening, heavy silence. Diane sank to her knees on the marble floor, burying her face in her hands, mourning the total destruction of her perfect suburban illusion. Naomi quietly picked up her designer clutch from the table. She gave me one final, deeply respectful nod of solidarity, pushed open the side exit door, and walked out into the evening air, leaving the toxic foster family behind forever. I turned my attention to my father. Richard was staring blankly out the window, watching the police cruiser pull away with his only son in the back seat. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, ruthless corporate titan was entirely gone. In his place stood an old, bankrupt, terrified man. His pristine executive armor was completely shattered. He looked at the floor, then looked up at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered despair. Abigail, Richard whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. The bank took the house. They took the accounts. We cannot go back to Fairfield. He swallowed hard, the terrifying reality of his absolute destitution finally taking root in his mind. He had no cash. He had no credit. He had absolutely nowhere to go. We have nothing. Richard choked out, a single tear escaping his eye. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? I looked at the man who had authorized the theft of my grandfather's money. The man who had stood by while I was thrown out into the freezing snow on Christmas Eve. The man who had demanded I sacrifice my entire life to fund his illusions. I calmly unclasped my designer purse, reached inside my wallet, and pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I held it out for a moment, letting him see it before I let it slip from my fingers. The green bill fluttered gently through the air, landing softly on the marble floor, right at the tip of his polished leather shoes. Find a cheap diner. I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as a Chicago winter. Grab a coffee. It is going to be a long night. 6 months have passed since the flashing red and blue police lights faded into the distance outside the Oak Ridge Country Club. In the real world, outside the insulated bubble of inherited wealth and suburban privilege, actions have immediate and devastating consequences. My family had to learn that lesson the hard way. Carter did not get a high-priced defense team. He did not get a slap on the wrist, and he certainly did not get a sympathetic judge. Federal prosecutors do not care about country club charm or prep school pedigrees. They care about paper trails, and I had handed them a flawless, irrefutable one. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of his forged commercial loan documents and the stolen credit card receipts, Carter took a plea deal to avoid a drawn-out trial that he was guaranteed to lose. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Today, the former golden child of the foster family is serving a 72-month sentence in a federal correctional institution. Instead of pitching fake tech startups to wealthy investors over expensive lunches, he spends his days sweeping the concrete floors of the prison cafeteria. His grand illusion has been entirely erased. Naomi, true to her word, did not waste a single second. She filed for an immediate annulment the very next morning. Because the marriage was based on documented criminal fraud, the judge granted her request with unprecedented speed. She legally severed herself from Carter before the ink on their wedding certificate even had a chance to dry. She returned to her medical career, completely untethered from the anchor that had tried to drag her underwater. We occasionally exchange emails, a quiet mutual respect existing between two women who refuse to be victims. For my parents, the downfall was less sudden than an arrest, but infinitely more agonizing. The eviction from their Fairfield estate happened exactly as the bank promised. The county sheriff arrived at their sprawling colonial home on a Tuesday morning. There was no time for Diane to maintain her dignified socialite facade. She was forced to pack whatever clothes she could fit into a few suitcases, while the deputies stood in her grand foyer, watching her every move. The neighbors, the exact same wealthy suburbanites my mother had spent decades trying to impress, stood on their manicured lawns and peeked through their custom blinds, watching the local authorities escort the foster family off the property. My private holding company systematically liquidated every single asset tied to the defaulted loan. The luxury vehicles were auctioned off. The imported Italian furniture was sold. The exclusive country club shares were revoked and transferred. I recouped my entire $850,000 investment within 3 months, plus a substantial legal margin. Richard and Diane were left with absolutely nothing. Their credit scores were completely obliterated by the massive foreclosure and their proximity to Carter's federal crimes. They were forced to rent a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city, located right next to a noisy, elevated highway. The walls are paper-thin, the carpets are stained, and the smell of old cooking oil constantly lingers in the hallway. It is a brutal, unforgiving environment for two people who once believed they were royalty. But the most devastating blow to my parents was not the loss of their money. It was the absolute crushing reality of their social exile. Toxic families thrive on having an audience. They need spectators to validate their superiority. When the wealth vanished, the audience completely evaporated. The dinner party invitations stopped arriving. Their phone calls to old friends went entirely straight to voicemail. The people they had hosted at their lavish Thanksgiving dinners wanted absolutely nothing to do with a family embroiled in a grand larceny scandal. Richard and Diane became social pariahs completely abandoned by the superficial community they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. I saw them in person one last time just last week. It was the final civil court hearing to officially close the probate on my grandfather's estate and formalize the permanent transfer of the trust into my name. I walked into the downtown county courthouse wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. I felt completely at peace. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to plague me whenever I had to share a room with my family was entirely gone. I spotted them sitting on a hard wooden bench in the brightly lit corridor outside the courtroom. They were waiting for the judge to officially dismiss their desperate last-minute petition for spousal support from the estate. The physical transformation was absolutely shocking. 6 months of poverty, public humiliation, and extreme stress had aged them both a decade. Richard was swimming inside an old, outdated gray suit that no longer fit his shrinking frame. His posture, once so arrogant and domineering, was completely hunched. Diane looked small and frail. Her expensive blonde hair coloring had grown out, revealing stark gray roots. She wore a simple faded sweater, her hands trembling slightly as they rested in her lap. The vicious elitist spark that used to burn so brightly in her eyes had been entirely extinguished. The hearing lasted less than 15 minutes. The judge reviewed the files, noted my grandfather's explicit instructions, and recognized the complete lack of legal standing my parents possessed. He struck down their petition with a single bang of his wooden gavel, officially locking them out of the foster family trust forever. I stood up from the plaintiff's table, shook Mr. Gallagher's hand, and walked out through the heavy swinging doors of the courtroom. Richard and Diane were waiting for me in the hallway. They pushed themselves off the wooden bench, their movements slow and heavy. They stepped directly into my path, forcing me to stop. "Abigail." Richard said, his voice a raspy, fragile whisper. He did not sound angry. He did not sound demanding. He sounded completely broken. I stood perfectly still, my expression entirely neutral. I did not cross my arms defensively. I did not glare at them. I simply looked at the two strangers standing in front of me. "Please, Abby." Diane whimpered, tears instantly welling up in her eyes. She took a step forward, her hands clasped together in front of her chest, in a desperate begging motion. "We have nothing left. The rent on the apartment is due next week, and Richard cannot find a job. Nobody will hire him with his background in this town. We cannot afford groceries. We are drowning. Just a small monthly stipend from the trust. That is all we are asking for. Just enough to survive." She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes, desperately hoping to find a single shred of the obedient, desperate daughter she had manipulated for 35 years. She was waiting for the guilt to set in. She was waiting for me to break. In the past, I would have caved. I would have felt the crushing weight of obligation. I would have opened my checkbook just to stop the crying and buy a temporary moment of peace. But as I looked at my mother's tears, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no vindictiveness, no sorrow, just a profound, liberating emptiness. The emotional cord had been permanently severed on that freezing Christmas Eve 5 years ago, and the events at the wedding had simply swept away the ashes. I did not deliver a dramatic monologue. I did not remind them of their cruelty or gloat about my victory or offer them a $20 bill. They were no longer worth the energy of a response. They had lost the privilege of hearing my voice. I simply adjusted my grip on my leather briefcase, stepped smoothly to the right, and walked directly past them. I did not look back when Diane let out a loud, shattering sob that echoed down the marble corridor. I did not stop when Richard called my name one final time, his voice cracking with pure despair. I kept my head high, my pace steady, and my eyes focused entirely on the bright glass doors at the end of the hallway leading out into the bustling, vibrant city. The bright afternoon sun felt incredibly warm on my face as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the bustling Chicago streets. For the first time in 35 years, I took a deep breath of city air and realized my shoulders were completely relaxed. The invisible crushing weight of my family's constant demands, their relentless judgment, and their toxic financial expectations had vanished. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the emergency bank account. I was just Abigail, and I was completely, undeniably free. I walked 3 blocks down the busy downtown pavement, blending in with the crowds of professionals on their lunch breaks, until I reached a towering modern glass skyscraper. I pushed through the revolving doors and crossed the expansive marble lobby, my heels clicking confidently against the polished floor. I stepped into the private executive elevator and swiped my security badge. The elevator smoothly ascended to the top floor, the numbers ticking upward, taking me far away from the grounded reality of the streets below. When the silver doors slid open, I stepped out into the newly rebranded headquarters of the Harrison Legacy Real Estate Group. The transformation of my grandfather's company was absolute. Gone was the dark, oppressive old boys' club aesthetic that Richard had tried to infect it with. The massive executive suite was now flooded with natural light from floor to ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling city skyline. The walls were painted in crisp, clean tones, adorned with modern art, and the framed architectural blueprints of my grandfather's original honest investments. A team of brilliant, dedicated professionals bustled around the open-concept workspace. They were not yes-men hired to stroke a fragile CEO's ego. They were sharp analysts, dedicated property managers, and top-tier financial advisors whom I had personally vetted and hired. As I walked down the main corridor toward my corner office, I exchanged warm smiles and brief productive updates with my staff. There was no fear in this office. There was no intimidation. There was only mutual respect and a shared drive to build something genuine. I sat down behind my massive oak desk, the exact same desk my grandfather had used to build his empire from the ground up. I opened my laptop and pulled up the quarterly financial reports. The numbers were pristine. The spreadsheets were completely green. Every single toxic asset had been liquidated. Every fraudulent liability tied to my father and brother had been severed and destroyed. The company was not just stable. Under my leadership and my rigorous forensic accounting protocols, the portfolio had grown by 22% in just 6 months. I had taken the shattered pieces of my family's ruin and forged an unbreakable foundation. I was financially secure, completely independent, and thriving in a space entirely my own. After reviewing a few commercial contracts, I closed my laptop, grabbed my designer coat, and headed back down to the street level. I had a very important lunch reservation to keep. I walked 2 blocks over to an upscale sunlit bistro known for its incredible Mediterranean menu and its quiet private patio seating. The hostess smiled warmly and led me to a corner booth surrounded by lush green ferns and vibrant flowering vines. Sitting at the table sipping a sparkling water and reading a medical journal was Naomi. She looked absolutely stunning. The heavy, exhausted shadow that had briefly clouded her eyes during that catastrophic wedding day was entirely gone. She wore a chic, tailored emerald green dress that complemented her beautiful skin perfectly. She radiated the calm, powerful energy of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and refused to settle for a single fraction less. When she saw me approach, Naomi set her journal down and stood up. We did not exchange the fake, rigid air kisses that the wealthy women in my mother's country club circle used to perform. We wrapped our arms around each other in a tight, genuine hug. It was a physical testament to a bond forged in the absolute fires of my family's destruction. "You look incredible, Abby," Naomi said, her voice warm and bright as we sat down at the table. "Operating a real estate empire definitely suits you better than sitting in a cubicle fixing other people's mistakes. And you look like a woman who just performed a flawless 12-hour surgery and still has the energy to run a marathon," I replied, picking up my menu with a genuine smile. We ordered our food and spent the next 2 hours talking about everything except Carter, Richard, and Diane. Those three names were permanently banned from our conversations. They simply did not matter anymore. Instead, we talked about our careers, our investments, and our future plans. Naomi excitedly told me about her recent promotion to the head of the anesthesiology department at her hospital. She had also just closed on a beautiful, spacious townhouse in a historic neighborhood, using her own pristine credit score and her own hard-earned savings. She was building her dream life completely unbothered by the pathetic man currently sweeping floors in a federal prison cafeteria. We shared a warm, genuine laugh over a ridiculous story about one of her eccentric hospital administrators. Listening to the sound of her laughter, I realized just how incredibly rare and beautiful this dynamic was. We were not legally sisters-in-law. The annulment had completely erased any legal connection between us. But we had become sisters in spirit. We were bound by our shared grit, our mutual respect for hard work, and our absolute refusal to let toxic, manipulative people dictate our worth. As the waiter cleared our plates and poured us 2 fresh cups of dark roast coffee, Naomi reached across the table and briefly squeezed my hand. "I never properly thanked you, Abby," she said, her tone shifting to a quiet, profound sincerity. "You could have walked away that day at the country club. You had the money, you had the trust, and you could have just let me sign my life away to a fraud to save yourself the drama. But you handed me that USB drive. You gave me the truth when everyone else was lying to my face. I owe you my freedom. You do not owe me anything, Naomi," I replied, squeezing her hand back. "You saved yourself. The moment you saw the truth, you did not hesitate. You ripped off the veil and walked out the door. That was all you." We finished our coffee in a comfortable, peaceful silence, enjoying the warm afternoon sun on the patio. There was no underlying tension. There were no hidden agendas. It was just two successful, independent women enjoying the life they had fought so hard to secure. Later that evening, I sat alone in the quiet comfort of my own penthouse living room. The city lights of Chicago twinkled through the massive windows like a sea of diamonds. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, the kind my parents used to buy with stolen credit cards, and I leaned back against my plush sofa. I thought about the entire chaotic, painful, and ultimately liberating journey. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that family loyalty meant setting myself on fire to keep them warm. I had been told that my worth was defined entirely by my usefulness to Carter's grand illusions. But the truth is, blood does not demand blind submission. Real family does not require you to sacrifice your financial stability, your mental health, or your personal dignity just to maintain a fake image of perfection. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to strike the match, burn the toxic bridge to the ground, and walk away by the light of the flames. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor, and looked directly into the reflection of the glass window. I had survived the scapegoat role. I had survived the financial manipulation. I had survived the public humiliation. And I had emerged as the sole architect of my own destiny. They thought they could erase me to protect their perfect image, But when you build your life on lies, it only takes one person holding the receipts to bring the whole house down. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you the most? Tell me your story in the comments.